Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm afraid I'm not able to speak French well enough to give this lecture in French. I hope this is all right if I speak English. And I'm very honored to be invited to this really beautiful institution, which I always wanted to see and visit since it's opened approximately 1 year ago. So I'm very glad to have the occasion today to walk through with you and to be here. I'm happy to introduce you to a project with which we have been occupied pretty intensely since approximately 3 years, and at the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, which is the States Museum of North Rhine-Westphalia museum, with a very good collection of classical modernism and contemporary art. And this project, the general title is Museum Global, and our particular title was Microhistories of an Ex-centric Modernism. And that project, Museum Global, was a very large research project, actually, which was initiated and financially enabled by the Federal Cultural Foundation of Germany, so by the States Foundation, Art Foundation of Germany. It's interesting to think or to be aware that this whole project was really initiated and financed by a governmental institution. I think this was also important for us. And the aim of this large project, Museum Global, was or is still to encourage museums in Germany to revision and discuss their collections in terms of a global context and post-colonial discourse. Until today, there were 3 museums in Germany who participated in that large research project, which was the MMK, Museum of Modern Art in Frankfurt. That time I was the director there. Then the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, this large museum for modern and contemporary art. And then the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, and then other museums will follow. So it happened coincidentally that I took part twice, because I'm now the director of Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf. In Düsseldorf, the curators started already before I arrived 3 years ago to analyze the collection and also to question in what way this museum and this particular collection has any aspects of a global context. And due to the individual collections of all the participating museums, this project found a very different form in each museum. Like, for example, in the MMK in Frankfurt, the museum is mainly a museum for contemporary art, so we did already work in a global context. So participating in Museum Global meant for us to find a partner in another continent, which was a partner in Buenos Aires, the Museo d'Arte Moderno Buenos Aires, and to exchange collections to bring to dialogue the collection of the MMK with the collection of Latin American museums. And then, for example, in the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, the Hamburger Bahnhof could or had access to the entire holdings of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. So this meant also including the ethnological collections and the entire art collections. So they could look within their own collections where there were aspects of non-Western artists and cultures. But in Düsseldorf, we had a very different situation. Düsseldorf, the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, is a very young museum, which was strategically founded. I will tell more about that later, and which has a very precisely compiled collection of Western modernism. So within our collection, there is no work of art which itself comes from a non-Western area. But what we did was to look within our collection to find works of art where there were so-called contact zones with other modernisms in other parts of the world. And we found different of such contact zones. For example, in Tokyo, 1910, in Moscow, 1930, in Sao Paulo, 1922, in Mexico City, 1923, in Shimla, in India, 1934, in Beirut, 1948, and in Série, 1960. So we just picked these 7 examples of such contact moments, and not each time not being a real physical contact, but sometimes just a mental contact. And we found out that in these moments of time and in these locations, major transcultural shifts took place in those years mentioned, similar to the context of European modernism. Shifts where artists articulated concepts of modernism, whether through publications or manifestos, exhibitions, traveling, or other encounters. And within these moments, in these places, these artists also positioned themselves towards Western modernism, either positively or negatively, but there was some kind of like discourse about the relationship between those artists and European modernism. And that was what we were particularly interested in. And we also, of course, found out that in these other places in the world, the situations were pretty similar to the one in Europe, which means there were larger societal and political changes which actually led to those shifts, social or broader shifts on a very fundamental level. So as you can see here, this is the ground floor of our museum, the ground and the second floor of our museum. We presented the artworks from those different parts in the world for the first time in the history of this museum's building, exactly there where we normally show the classics of our collection, the Picasso and the Miro and whatever. So that was quite some statement, but also we wanted to raise questions connected to the post-colonial discourse through this form of installation and through the juxtaposition with the works from our collection. Like, for example, how do national and cultural identities emerge? How are migration and exile reflected in the works of individual artists in different places in the world? What cultural political influences does travel, encounter, and exchange have? And finally, what social and political changes lead to a rejection of traditions of art and also traditions of hierarchies? And as you can see here on that side, there's a very large hall in our museum, and only through this hall you can enter the museum from like the broad outside. Yeah, normally you enter the museum differently. You have to walk like a narrow aisle, but we wanted to open the museum via this very large hall, because that whole project did not mean only an opening up of our collection in terms of a global perspective, but also an opening up of our institution towards a very broader audience. Yeah? So also about this I can speak very quickly later. So we started our project with a so-called prologue, a collection traveling around the world, because we wanted to describe, first of all, the history of our museum, how that museum started and how it came that it was built in the 60s. And the story was that in 1959, the state of Nordrhein-Westphalia, which was just founded after World War II, the state acquired 88 works of Paul Klee from a private American collection as an act of cultural political reparation. The minister-president at that time, Franz Meyers, wanted to make a kind of posthumous homage to Paul Klee, who was, of course, a victim by the Nazis, and to create a new cultural identity for the new state of North Rhine-Westphalia, a culture of freedom after Nazi Germany. And after having bought that collection of 88 works of Paul Klee, the Kunstsammlung was founded in 1961. So that means the Kunstsammlung was not founded on the basis of larger collections or some kind of traditions within the city or some kind of taking over of already existing collections. No, it was really started as a very new project in 1961. Paul Klee, as you all know, was one of the famous representatives of modernism in Germany, and he had a professorship at the States Academy in Düsseldorf from 1931 to 1933, after he had been teaching at the Bauhaus in Weimar and then later in Dessau. But pretty immediately after the Nazis took over, he actually was attacked and ostracized, and he was called a Jew, although he never was a Jew. And by this assumption that he would be a Jew, which was wrong, he was dismissed from the academy in 1933. And he had to leave Germany to go to Switzerland. So that was really the reason why the state said we have to make some kind of reparation and reconciliation, and we can do this through this body of works. And then on the basis of that body of works, here you can see the old building of the first museum in 1960. These are documents about this whole process around dismissing him from the academy. And on the basis of this artworks of Paul Klee, founding director Werner Schmalenbach started to build up a collection of international modernism, which in that time in Europe meant European modernism. And that was like Braque and Picasso, Modigliani, Miro. So this is how the whole museum started. But what was interesting for our project, Museum Global, was that Schmalenbach and also the state of North Rhine-Westphalia sent the collection of Paul Klee into the world. They sent the collection of the work of Paul Klee to 26 countries on 4 continents. Like that was Eastern European countries like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, but then it was also South America, including Brazil and Argentina. It was Australia and New Zealand, Asia, including India, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Manila. And the first country the collection of Paul Klee was, where the collection was sent to, was Israel. The first stop was in Jerusalem, and then later, of course, in Tel Aviv. And of course, starting in Jerusalem meant to establish a friendly relationship with Israel. So that was some kind of interesting starting point for our project because we really wanted to see, is there any idea of a larger context in a global sense in the history of this museum, and this was for us an interesting aspect we wanted to point out. And then we started with the so-called microhistories. We called them microhistories because we wanted to take up these little moments we found and to tell them in a kind of a small story, in a chapter. And within the chapter, we wanted to bring to dialogue the works from these other places in the world together with selected artworks from our museum. So, for example, in Japan, in 1910 in Tokyo, the country was in a state of change and upheaval, pretty similar to this state of change which we had in Europe and many countries. And modernization of art in Tokyo also went hand in hand with political and social developments. Like until the mid-19th century, Japan still followed a very rigorous isolationist policy to the rest of the world, but in the second half of the 19th century, the country increasingly opened itself to external influences, and that meant also art. So, for example, from the late 80s, from the 19th century on, Japanese artists started to travel to Europe and studied art in Paris, Rome, Munich, and Berlin, made contact to local art circles, and became acquainted to European art history, and brought that, of course, also back to Tokyo through catalogs, sometimes small exhibitions even, and there was this kind of really strong discourse about European modernism in contemporary art in Tokyo in that time. And here you can see a very interesting reference we found. On the right-hand side, you can see a work from our collection, which is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Girl Under Japanese Parasol. And on the left-hand side, you see a work by Yuroso Tetsugoro, Nude Beauty, from 1912. The Kirchner is from 1909. And it was not, there is no evidence or anything that these both artists have met, or that, for example, Tetsugoro has seen concretely images of the Kirchner. But it is so incredibly obvious that there was a very strong kind of dialogue, maybe even mentally, between these two figures, because you can not only see that the motif is very similar, but of course also the style. And we found it interesting to research a little bit what was the context of the Nude Beauty of Tetsugoro, and we found out that this was his work, one of his graduation works when he left academy. And his teacher, Kuroda Seiki, where you see an image in the middle of these three paintings, still followed a very traditional mode of painting. But then you can also realize that the way how Tetsugoro kind of left academy has been a quite provocative gesture towards traditional painting in Japan. Yeah? And this very striking resemblance between the motif and the style between the Kirchner and the Tetsugoro, of course, shows that even if there was not a direct relation between the two artists, there was a very intense kind of mental exchange between German Expressionism and modernism starting in that time in Japan. In that context, in this context of opening up in Japan, there was one figure which was called Takamura Kotaro. He was a student of Rodin, actually, and he wrote a manifest called The Green Sun. And in this manifest, he demanded for the unrestricted authority of the artistic individual, which meant complete artistic freedom, freedom from traditions, but also which led to this aspect of self-questioning. And in that context, there was a boom of self-portraits, and you can see different various examples of self-portraits of Yorosu Tetsugoro, which also very strongly in style. So you can see that they really tried out and tested what was possible. And around this manifesto of the Green Sun, there was also a group of artists called the Futsai, the Futsai Inkai group, and they made exhibitions, publications. They were really intensely working on this whole idea of liberating art in Japan in that time. But this went on until 1923, and then it stopped. But for us, it was really interesting to find out that at the same time as the German expressionists in Germany, in Berlin, worked on their kind of shift from painterly tradition, something very similar happened in Tokyo in 1910, and we put that in a relation in this little microhistory about Tokyo in 1910. By the way, I just want to pick out 4 of these microhistories because it would be probably too long to talk about the 7, and if these 4 are also too long, we can also stop after 2 or 3, whatever you want, depending from your plans tonight. So another example which we presented in form of very small so-called microhistory was Sao Paulo in 1922, and what you can see here are 3 paintings of Lhasa Segal, Tarsila do Amorau, and Anita Malfatti. And this is a larger story which where we found only like one point to one of the works of our collection, but at the same time we found like a general atmosphere which kind of connected Europe to Sao Paulo in 1922. And this was strongly, we were strongly circling around this painter called Lhasa Segal, Jewish painter, which was born in AD 91 in Vilnius in Lithuania and died in the late 50s in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And he was one of the figures who crossed borders, who was mediating really between Europe and Latin America in that time. He played a very important role for German expressionism in the early 19th century, 20th century, but then really completely moved to Sao Paulo, and then there he became really influential for Brazilian modernism. And of course, his main subject or his main topic was migration, because that was his biography, having been a migrant the whole during his whole life and his biography. And this painting you can see here, called Eternal Wanderer from 1919, marks the beginning of his emigrant series and his what do you call it? His investigation in migration and placelessness. And that work was included in the exhibition Entartete Kunst, which is familiar to you, the Nazi exhibition about modernist art, which took place in Munich in 1973. And at the same time, there was this other work, which you can see on the right-hand side, by Max Beckmann. It's called Die Nacht. It is one of the most famous paintings by Max Beckmann. And this is in our collection. Yeah? So this is, for example, we found a really interesting moment of contact, having these two works of art being both in the Munich exhibition in 1937. And we showed in our exhibition this very large painting, Ships of Emigrants, from 1939 to 1940. This is a really unusual painting because it's really large. It's nearly 250 by nearly 3 meters large, very large for that time actually. And it just shows how intensely Lasser-Segal was really occupied with this whole idea of migration. And we found also that it fits so really clearly to our times today, yeah? Because of course when we started to work on that project, we were in 2015, and that was really the peak of the migrant crisis in Berlin and in Europe, but also really particularly also in Berlin. And there's a little document which you probably cannot read but can see. It's a very nice letter which we showed also in the exhibition by the author Stefan Zweig, who had fled to Brazil. And he wrote to Lasser-Segal, not knowing that Lasser-Segal was already painting or already working on that painting. He wrote, I quote him, if only you could depict all the misery of today's refugees in front of their consulates, on the ships, in the railways, on the streets, it would be a huge frieze stretching from one end of the world to the other. You would thus create a document of this time. And then Lasser-Segal responded to him immediately saying, by the way, the subject of emigration, refugees, is not just a topical issue for me. I regard people as eternal refugees and have always dealt with this problem in my art. So he was already painting on that very large picture or painting when he got this letter by Stefan Zweig. And then we showed also this other image from 1924, which was called Incontro. And this is a self-portrait together with his wife, which he completed just shortly after he moved to Sao Paulo. And we found that image really extremely significant for this whole issue of identity, because it shows so clearly. It's really interesting if you look at that, if you analyze that picture, you can see him, the painter himself. He depicted himself already as a colored person, because he already felt assimilated to the people in Brazil, but his wife still looks white and European. But you can also see that both of them cannot connect anymore to each other. Yeah, the eyes, the gazes don't cross each other, and while she is probably already looking back to Europe, he decided to stay in Brazil. So this whole issue of identity and self-positioning in this context of migration, I think is in that image really extremely significant. And then in Sao Paulo, there is also another really interesting figure which we wanted to show in this little microhistory. And this is the artist Tarsila do Amorão. And in that time in Brazil, in the early 20s, or in the even if you say like in the late 19th century up to the early 20s, Brazil is still strongly under European influence and trying to kind of cope with not being colonialized anymore, but being still strongly influenced by European culture. and trying to find, especially in the arts, trying to find the own identity and what could that be, was one of the main issues in Sao Paulo in that time. And so in that context, there was something which was called the Semana de Arte Moderna, the Week of Modern Art, which took place in a theater in Sao Paulo city in 1922, and that was kind of regarded the initial moment of modernist movement in Brazil. And you can see here a publication called Claxon, Mensario de Arte Moderna, which was the first international art magazine in Brazil. And in that arts magazine, Brazilian editors and Brazilian artists invited artists from all over the world, especially from Europe, from Belgium, from France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, to create a transnational network. Yeah? So they already also watched what was going on in Europe. I mean, of course, through colonialization, they were already extremely aware of Europe anyway, but then they wanted to get more contact closer contact to the European artists. And one of the main figures in this context, next to Anita Malfatti, for example, was Tarsila do Amorão, and this is the lady here on that, on the left-hand side painting. And she was not only a painter. She came from a wealthy family and coffee plantation family, and positioned herself as a modern woman in Brazil. And she was also a collector. And what you can see here on the left, no, on the right-hand side, is her own so-called salon, where you can see quite a bit of European paintings from very famous modernists in that time. And and she also went to Paris, studying with Fernand Léger. And what you see in the middle is a work of, with Fernand Léger, and also, of course, with Delaunay. And what you see here in the middle is a painting from our collection, from Robert Delaunay. And when you see her painting from 1924, you can see how strongly she kind of related to even motifs of European modernist painters. She was also, in that time, very, very ostentatively including in her painting aspects from Brazilian folk art, because one important aspect of this Brazilian modernism was to look closely at Brazilian folk art. The same happened, of course, here, especially Germany, if you think of the Blauer Reiter, but of course also here in Paris in that time. And it's really interesting to see in what way the two aspects of European modernism and like the own aspect of the own country, the Brazilian folk art, come together in paintings like that one, Carnaval Madureira. One aspect is also really nice in that painting, that the Eiffel Tower appears as a motif, but it is detached from its context. It's detached from the urban context and put into the rural context. Yeah? So the rural context and the folk art, that was really what Brazilian artists were looking at when they tried to find their own modernist identity. And there was also an interesting manifest in that time, which was called Manifesto Antropophago, the Anthropophagic Manifest of 1928, and this was kind of the main idea of Brazilian modernism, and even in contemporary art in Brazil today, but also if you think of the 60s in Brazil, they all kind of refer back to this Manifesto Antropophago from 1928. And this movement also was located around the artist Tarsila do Amorão and the writer Oswald de Andrade. And what did they mean with anthropophagia? Anthropophagia means, of course, now I'm lacking the English word, cannibalism. Yeah? What did they mean with cannibalism? Why cannibalism? And if you look at the paintings of Tarsila do Amorão from 1929, it's a very, very strange language she found for this, what they called anthropophagia. And what it meant was that they wanted to internalize not only Western modernism, but also all the influences of Western colonialization during this whole last centuries. Yeah? They thought that through internalizing it, like formally through eating it, they can transform it and find or appropriate it, transform it, and find their own language, their own some kind of power and strength. So that was the kind of leading metaphor in Brazilian modernism in that time. And then there's another microhistory we also presented in the exhibition around one work of our collection, and this is the work you see in the middle. It's a work from Modigliani, Amadeo Modigliani, and it's a portrait of his artist friend Diego Rivera from 1914, and it's also in the collection of the Kunstsammlung. So this is also one of these contact zones we researched in. And we showed the portrait of Modigliani together with this painting by Diego Rivera, which was called Zapatista Landscape, and which is a cubist style painting, but with a very clear political agenda. And in that time, when Modigliani and Rivera met in Paris in the 10s and early 20s, or late 10s and early 20s, of course, Cubism was what was happening. And this painting, for example, of Modigliani, that is not one of those paintings where Cubism, where you can see like formal aspects of Cubism, but strange kind of different. It's a very particular portrait actually of Modigliani, painted by Modigliani. And so around this Cubist painting by Diego Rivera, which was really politically so loaded, we found it interesting to show that the way Rivera adapted Cubism was just like a form, but the content or what he wanted to speak about was really his clear political agenda. And so in 1921, Rivera returned to his home country, to Mexico, to really participate in the politically or in the political changes and in the restructuring of post-revolutionary Mexico. So in 1922, he co-founded the so-called Syndicate of Workers, Painters and Sculptors, where you can see the little manifesto here on that plate, and this manifesto was also part of some documents and materials we showed in the exhibition. And here in this manifesto, he expresses very clearly that it is also in Mexico the art of the people which kind of has the highest and greatest value for modern art. Yeah? So it's interesting that in Latin America, in Sao Paulo, but also in Mexico, the influence from European modernism, which was a very which came from a really urban context, they transformed that or kind of brought that together with a very different kind of idea, really addressing the people, really addressing and trying to find a language to address the broad people. And pretty soon after that period, you can see here on the right-hand side, Riviera also changed his style of painting and painted in a way which was clearly readable for everybody, trying really to express his political agenda in a very broad and readable language. And there was one kind of side aspect we also wanted to show within this microhistory, and this is the side aspect or the story of a woman called Luz Jiménez, which was painted and portrayed here by Diego Rivera, but she was also portrayed and painted by many other artists not only in Latin America, but also by modernist artists from Europe who visited Mexico in that time. And she was a woman from the indigenous, she was an indigenous woman, and born in the late 19th century close to Mexico City. She experienced the revolution in her home country, lost her family, she fled, and then she found a job as a model for modernist painters. But then the painters became so attracted in her way of living, in that what she kind of, which she seemed to express in her whole, in her body, in her way of living, in her way of also expressing herself, that she became some kind of role model in Mexico in that time, Luz Jiménez. And later she also became a poet and wrote poets in her own indigenous language, and being always really in the middle, in the center of this modernist movement in Mexico, but then really also photographed by, for example, by Edward Weston or by Tina Modotti, and painted by other contemporary painters from Europe in that time. And that was also something we found interesting in relation, if you think about Gauguin, for example, yeah, or other aspects of indigenous traditions, indigenous cultures, which were which were, how would you say that, which were kind of not fetishized, but really, maybe fetishized by modernist art. What did he do? Idealized. Yeah, idealized, yes, idealized. There is one last small chapter I just would like to present here, which is taking place in the 30s in Shimla in India, and which is in the center of which stands the Indian-Hungarian painter Amrita Shergill. Amrita Shergill is really like the modernist figure in Indian painting. She's really extremely famous in India, in Delhi, in the National Gallery of Modern Art. They have the entire estate of her. There is an Amrita Shergill Boulevard in Delhi, and actually at the moment we are trying to work on a large retrospective exhibition of her work in Düsseldorf, but it is really extremely complicated because her work is considered national treasure and is not meant to leave country. So we have to find a way to persuade the politicians to get the work out of the country. So not many of her works have been shown in Europe, basically only the ones which are in European collections. And these are private collections of relatives of Amrita Shergill, one of which is living in Hamburg, by the way. So Amrita Shergill was born in Budapest in 1913, and then she died very, very early in 1941 in Lahore. So in this not even 30 years, she painted a huge body of works and lived a very bohemian life. First, she lived in Hungary with her family, and then they went to Paris, as you can see here. And it's really kind of funny because it must have been a really eccentric family. They moved to Paris in the 30s, and she studied at the École de Paris, in the École des Beaux-Arts here in Paris, and was of course intensely preoccupied with Matisse, with Picasso, and the modernisms of the École de Paris. And her mother was an opera singer, her father was an artist himself. You can see here a self-portrait of the father together with his daughter. He was a member of the Sikh religion, and he made innumerable self-portraits of himself, of course, in various roles, like an Indian, an European, a scholar, a craftsman, a father, family man, and so on. So the question of identity was already seemingly a very discussed one in the family of Amrita Shergill, and will later be in the work of Amrita herself. And at the same time, she was preoccupied with modernism, which she learned about here in Paris. She also investigated in the pictorial tradition of her own country, of course. And so, for example, in this self-portrait as a Tahitian, you can see many different aspects of what she was kind of involved in. So, for example, it's a self-portrait which is rather large, also for that time. It is nearly 1 meter high, and she's naked. She portrays herself as an indigenous person, and relates probably to Gauguin's paintings of indigenous women, which she saw in Paris. But there are also other interesting aspects in this painting. For example, it seems that she's also thematizing a kind of complicated relationship to the French masters, which she at the same time admired, but at the same time and at the other hand also wanted to find her own identity, against them or against their influence. So you can recognize some kind of male figure behind her as a kind of a shadow, and it is thought that this male shadow, which is behind her body, might be a reference to one of the representatives of European modernism. But then there's also this kind of Chinese tapestry in the background, which again, which alludes to this big fascination of exotic cultures in that time here in Paris and also in Germany, which we saw in the beginning. The girl, this nude, the painting by Kirchner of this Mädchen mit dem Japanschirm, which was also some kind of Japonism. So this whole question of exotizing other cultures at the same time being under strong influence of European modernism, all this was something which preoccupied Amrita Shergill very strongly. And so she decided in 1934 to return back to India, and she went to Shimla, where she then really studied pre-colonial art, really traditional Indian art, the mural paintings of Buddhist monks in southern India, and miniature paintings of the Mughal empires, and so on. You can see in the two paintings here how both influences enter her painting. On the one hand, the very traditional art of India, but then on the other hand, if you compare it to the Matisse from our collection, there are, of course, strongly visible the influences, painterly influences from French modernism or European modernism. And then she said, I quote her, "I can only paint in India. Elsewhere, I'm not myself. I have no self-confidence. Europe belongs to Picasso, Matisse and Braque, as well as many others. But India belongs to me." So maybe Amrita Shergill, or the figure of Amrita Shergill, or the paintings of Amrita Shergill show very clearly how much this influence on the one hand, but also the whole relationship towards Western modernism, how strongly that was a challenge for modernist painters in other continents. Because on the one hand, they of course wanted to find their own language, like you could see in the paintings of Tarsila do Amorão, but on the other hand, they always had to fight kind of against this very strong influence of European modernism. And for us, it was really important in our museum, which has such a canonical collection of European modernism, like for the first time in the history of this museum, really to show that there was not only European modernism. I would say in the city of Düsseldorf and in our local audience, nobody has always thought that there might have been other modernisms in other places of the world. So that was our main intention, really to show, to find examples of these even really small moments of contact, yeah, maybe even just mental or maybe even a bit constructed moments of contact between different cultures and areas to really show that what we have in Europe is just one aspect of modernism. But on the other hand, it is also really clear, or became very clear to us, that these modernist painters in these other countries and places of the world could not paint around European modernism. This was kind of always some kind of foil, which on the one hand helped to open up or to shift, to break with painterly traditions, and on the other hand also was some kind of very strong influence and kind of maybe even some kind of law, yeah, some kind of painterly law, which they wanted to fight against and find their own positions. So that's basically what we try to do in this exhibition, and I'm stopping now because it's 1 hour already. I just want to quickly show you. Like, that was this kind of open space we constructed. We built this together with a Berlin architect they called Raumlabor, and they are always working on the border between the institution and the public space, and this was some kind of semi-public space where we had free entrance for the time of the exhibition, which could be used by anybody, but where we of course also offered all kinds of programs. But it was really nice to watch that besides these programs, which you can see here, after a couple of weeks people started to come to read whatever books we laid out, to get information about the exhibition, but also just to come and sit down and have coffee. Or, for example, there were school kids, because there's a school around the corner, and they started to make their Hausaufgabengruppe afterwards in our space, yeah, or some. So it showed that if the museum offers a public space with free entrance where you can get cheap coffee and maybe offer some magazines and some books and some other information, people come, they use it, and there is some kind of need for these kind of public spaces. And because this was so successful, and people really wrote us that this was so missed, and they really appreciated that so much. We decided that once a year we want to open this great hall regularly for this kind of an open space. Yeah, normally it's used as an exhibition hall, and we make large installations or choreographies or other forms of exhibitions. But now we decided that, like, once a year we really open it up, and we use this architecture from this Berlin architects to invite people to come to our museum. Well, I think I stop here. It's already used already a lot of your attention. Thank you.